and welcome to Tent Talk, the Farmers Market Podcast. This is the show all about farmers markets. Whether you're a farmers market manager, a farmer, or a food producer selling at farmers markets, or just a curious farmers market shopper, this is the podcast for you. On today's episode of Tent Talk Podcast, we're talking with Forrest Pritchard of Smith Meadows Farm in Berryville, Virginia. Forrest is a sustainable farmer and a New York Times bestselling author. On this episode, we talk about how he came to take over his family's farm, we talk about the effect of farmers markets on farm profitability, and how he's able to balance a career as a farmer and a successful author. Hi, I'm one of your hosts, Justine Marzoni-Mead. I'm a hot sauce maker and event facilitator for the Intense Conference.
Hi, I'm Bridget Myers. I spent years as an on-site farmers market manager, and I've done it all from pulling permits to popping tents.
And I'm Kat Fields-White, Director of San Diego Markets, still an active farmers market manager balancing the number of attendees with the number of portable toilets and the founder of Intense Business.
Welcome back to Tent Talk. Our guest this week is Forrest Pritchard. Forrest is a seventh-generation farmer. His farm, Smith Meadows, is one of the oldest grass-finished farms in the country. And his 2013 book, Gaining Ground, A Story of Farmers Markets, Local Food, and Saving the Family Farm, was named a top read by Publishers Weekly, The Washington Post, and NPR's The Splendid Table. And it made the New York Times bestsellers list. He followed this in 2015 with Growing Tomorrow, which was a finalist for Independent Cookbook of the Year, and Forrest's newest book, Start Your Farm, A Complete Beginner's Guide to Establishing a Successful Farm, launches this September. Forrest, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to talk with us.
Of course. Thanks for the honor of letting me yap at you.
Of course. So obviously you wrote a lot of what we want to talk to you about in your book. But for those people who haven't had the chance to read Gaining Ground yet, I just wanted to start, if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how it was like to grow up in a farm and kind of the beginning of what led you to where you are today.
Right. I'll do all that in 10 words or less.
Yeah, perfect. You are a poet. Can you write it in a haiku?
Exactly. I'm also of like a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian descent. And
wow, we could be here for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like I grew up on my grandparents' farm, which was pretty idyllic. I mean, I don't want to say like it was like Huckleberry Finn, but I did run around barefoot with impunity, miles distant at the summons of a dinner bell, coming over the hills to a certain degree. And that makes an impression on you as a kid. It kind of anchors you in a space and a sacredness of the land that you kind of become tethered in such a way that is unlikely if I had, been born in the suburbs or born in the city. Yeah. And I couldn't say that. I couldn't have told you that was happening in real time, but in hindsight, it was incredibly impactful, and it gives you a sense of stewardship and, the longevity of human impact on agricultural practices. That it's not all this short term. There's these long term, kind of almost like glacial or geological phenomenon that are happening. So, when I came back to the farm, I went away to college and did all that stuff and I wanted to come back to the farm for a year until I got a quote unquote real job. Right.
What's that?
And,
We avoid those at all costs.
Right. Some of us are lucky enough to do that. And I know a lot of folks are kind of mired in places that are intended to be temporary, and you end up spending your whole life there. And, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. I came back to the farm. I took the agricultural advice of our main, land grant institutions and very well-intentioned people, our extension service and other farmers and, et cetera. And basically herbicided off about half of our farm, which had been perennial pastures, grazing cattle. And, keeping in mind this was 1996, there was no real, commodity-based solution. Commodity meaning you put something on the back of the truck, whether it be corn or apples or cattle or, you name it, send it down the road and you get a check in the mail. There was no real panacea. It was all pretty bad odds. But the most reliable thing seemed to be take these miracle chemicals in the form of herbicides and the very nascent GMO crops that were linked to these herbicides and kill off your fields and plant these things. And at least you could have some predictable return in the form of $3 or $4 a bushel corn. But what happened that year in particular was we had a terrible drought on the East Coast. And, the scale here on the East Coast is, a 500-acre farm is pretty big, whereas in the Midwest, 500 acres could be like somebody's glorified backyard.
Yeah.
They're 10,000 acres of corn or soybeans or wheat. And that's neither here nor there. It's just a market comparison. And we got our harvest in while the Midwest was having such a bumper crop that they were, using parking lots. They couldn't put the corn everywhere. They were just dumping it in tractor trailer loads out on the asphalt and hoping that it didn't rain.
Wow.
There's pictures of all this stuff. So we ended up making, the farmer came in. We thought we were going to make $10,000 a piece. We ended up making $18.16 a piece, and all those voices of all the good intentioned farmers saying, hey, go get a real job. You've got a college degree. Are you crazy? Why are you going to try and be a farmer? All came crashing back on one end, and the other end was this wave of humiliation that I felt saying look, I know people have to eat. It can't be this can't be the end. We all have to wake up every morning across the country and get food. Where's it going to come from? And how can I figure out how to make a living? And, I was fortunate enough that my parents had met Joel Salatin on one end in the late 80s, and I kind of had his influence a little bit. And then I had my grandparents' influence, who had made a living up to the mid-1970s. And I just said, I'm going to figure this out, or I'm going to go down trying.
Yeah.
And through farmers markets, through our on-farm store, through a very select handful of restaurants, 22 years later at this point, we're grossing more than $1 million annually.
Wow.
Which is a far cry from $20.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you keep all of that, right? All that million, that all goes in your pocket?
Oh, yeah. No, I actually, yeah. No, we try to make about 10% is what we try and do. And, 10% at $100,000 is goes a long way towards a comparable white-collar salary that I presumably would have somehow gotten if I'd, not been a farmer, laughing.
So how long did it take you to switch over to the more natural farming methods that you use today?
Yeah, great question. So, lest your listeners have forgotten, there was, there's nothing really called the internet in 1996, or if there was, it was I remember going on to ESPN, for example, just for some of your younger listeners, and there's one page on ESPN, it was they had the baseball scores, and that was it.
And it
takes
takes
30
minutes to load. Yeah.
Yeah. Right? And I was this is never going to catch on. I could get this in my paper.
I just go to the library. Be a lot faster.
Yeah. Exactly. But little did I know, I should have invested in a Microsoft or whatever. Yeah. But
yeah, you invested in the wrong type of apple.
Yeah, the wrong type of apple.
Sorry.
Exactly.
All right, please go on.
That's perfect. Our humor is aligned. But so the resources were pretty scattered. So I'm working on. I just finished this new book with Ellen Paulshuck, and she very wisely has this chapter in there saying you can either have time. You either need time or money, preferably both, to start a farm. And the trick with starting out with just money is there's no end of money you can legitimately spend on a farm. It can be the proverbial money pit.
Yeah.
So you need to have the time to build your experience kind of contemporaneously as the money builds. That's the sweet spot. So you have the experience to use the money wisely. And so I fortunately, even though I didn't have the internet or the books, to kind of accelerate my experience, I had my folks who, God bless them, they couldn't make a living at farming, and who could in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was incredibly difficult. So they had off-farm jobs. So they were basically paying the land taxes and, keeping the lights on. And I was operating with no budget. Okay. So for the first 5, 6, 7 years, I was just figuring stuff out to do it as cheaply, as efficiently, as mistake prone as possible. to figure out what worked and what didn't, and what was like a good use of my time, what wasn't. How could I spend, maybe $100 to improve things? And then if the $100 solution didn't work out, you'd kind of drop back and meditate and assess. So, wash, rinse, and repeat that over the course of 20 years. And, I don't pretend to have stuff figured out, but I do have systems at this point that work extremely well. So as long as my pigs don't end up on the highway and, as long as the customers keep showing up at farmers market, it seems to go pretty well.
And discovering farmers markets was a turning point for you, right? In terms of the financial viability of the farm?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm in a very rural community out here, and I'm in a town of roughly 5,000. I'm 4 miles outside of a town of 4,000, 4 or 5,000. And, I tried to, reach out to my community, and I still have some really, old/long-term customers who've been with me for 20 years. But for the most part, the food I was growing just wasn't valued. They didn't, the folks out here didn't see the value of free-range, grass-fed animals for whatever reason, whether they thought they could grow it their own, whether they were hunting, whether, grandpa would give them a steer every year, fill in the blank. So it wasn't until I made that leap to, the quote unquote big city of Washington, D.C., which, it's like the 10th biggest city in the country, where people were really appreciating fresh food. And they had that disconnect of I was providing value to them, essentially. They saw value in what I was doing for a slightly higher price point. And that's what I still continue to do this day.
How far do you travel to get to your big markets?
Oh, it's not too far. It's about an hour.
Oh, that's not bad.
We're 60 miles from Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
The truck practically drives itself.
Autopilot. Sip the coffee. Just keep going.
Exactly. Put on the Sirius.
But
Sirius
the
XM.
comparison. So, do you still sell to restaurants as well?
Restaurants are very temperamental relationship.
Yeah.
I like to be courted by restaurants because typically at that point the chef has done his or her due diligence. They know what we're about and why they should be communicating with us. So much of food comes off the back of a Cisco truck or whatever the regional distributor is.
Yeah.
That I don't like to have to be that salesman because chefs get sales pitched all day long, and then I have to differentiate myself when I know I'm selling a very special, I consider a sacred product.
Right. And then do they expect you to compromise price too when you're selling to restaurants?
Yeah. Definitely.
Because they're comparing you to Cisco.
Of course. And that's, at the end of the day, chefs have to make their margin and all this stuff, but I'm growing a product that I've raised by hand, and then I've taken it to the butcher shop myself and slaughtered it. And that's a very much more invested. I've got a lot more invested emotionally and financially than that. So, another farmer once told me that chefs they try to have a grade A product at a grade B price.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's not unusual. So, my preference is to receive that phone call or that email query from the chef and then begin that conversation on that end, rather than me walking in with some samples.
Yeah.
What do you think the margin difference is when you sell to even a restaurant that's aware of the value of your product? Do you think there's a significant difference in your profit margin when you sell to a chef versus selling to a consumer at a farmer's market?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So, there's pure wholesale, which is typically, rule of thumb is regarded 50%, sometimes as much as 66%. God bless those people that can get away with that. We do what's called a hybrid wholesale. We do 20% discount.
Okay.
Yeah. So 20%, but my rule of thumb is I try and take my product and add 100% onto it. And then, from a gross margin standpoint, and then by the time seasonality works its way out, we have the 3-foot snowstorms and the 2-month droughts and all that stuff. My 10% net margin, ends up being more reflective. So as long as I don't take that 100% and drop it back to 50%, you know how that math works. You got to go up 100% to drop back 50%.
Yeah.
As long as I compromise at that 20% and I'm moving, at least $500 to $1,000 worth of product. It seems to, the economic wheels seem to remain greased. I'm sure if I had a CPA come in and audit me, he'd probably throttle me. You know, a little bit.
Oh well, some
But,
of it's just love, and you can't account for that, right?
yeah,
You
that's
probably
true.
get a little more margin. You're doing value-added items as well, though, now, right?
Yeah, we do value added wherever we can. So, value add to us translates into hot dogs or beef jerky or chili or empanadas. I go down the list.
Right.
Um,
And that
yeah.
margin's
So,
probably a little better than just the straight meat, right?
well, I tried to have a lot of, arrows in my quiver or tools in my toolbox.
Not all those eggs in one basket.
Yeah, exactly. Insert your analogy, your metaphor. Yeah, so the more I can come across as being a one-stop fits all service, and that's never going to be entirely possible. But the more I am a service to the customer, and the more I'm a part of their ritual and their habits, and reliable to them, and that's the key.
Yeah. I know that you and I both have a pet peeve about the word farmer's market being bandied about to market a variety of things. Think there's any way we'll ever be able to, hashtag keep your word and keep other people from using the word farmer's market on townhouses and convenience stores and airport shops?
Right. Are you asking me to rant, or do I have to just?
This is your
I
moment.
love ranting, but a limited time period of ranting, and then we'll get back to philosophical discussion.
Giving you a soapbox.
Right. Right. Well, I'll see if I can put like a little sound bite on this one. It's like everything that everything that's like authentic and genuine and people try to do well. As soon as it catches on, corporate business just swoops in and tries to co-op it. Right. And it all becomes meaningless. It becomes nonsense. Like organic is just like it just makes your eyes roll at this point. And sustainable doesn't necessarily mean anything, or heirloom. These are all like, they're almost like, they become so co-opted that they become cliche, and it's you try to take, yeah, I'm sure.
Do we have a new word that we can use that hasn't been snagged yet?
We have to think of something.
Yeah, people try,
Yeah.
eco-friendly and holistic and, all this stuff, which are all real, they're all real words, and they're all like emblematic of what we're actually doing.
Yeah,
It's
they
just
have
there's
real
so much-
meaning at
Yeah,
their
of
core.
Who knew?
Of course, until you just get bombarded, and just a case in point, like within the past week, it's come to my attention that, grass-fed beef from New Zealand, Australia, Uruguay, Argentina has been, based on our USDA, allowed to resemble, have the appearance of being born and raised in the United States, because the labeling allows all that to occur.
In fact, they prohibit us from identifying it as being grown offshore, right? I mean, we're not even allowed to put on the label.
That might be the case.
Yeah, I think in wholesale environments, and farmers markets have a little bit different rules, but actually in wholesale environments, I think the whole beef council lobby kind of thing actually had a deal last year where they were prohibited from labeling where the source of the meat was.
Wow.
Sure.
So that so that they could import
wouldn't
meat,
surprise
and there could be no comparison.
Yeah. And if some of your listeners are on here saying, "Well, I'm a vegetarian, this doesn't apply to me," it impacts all of us. It impacts all of us. This is all the vast landscape of sustainable agriculture, and we're all allies when it comes down to this. And I could very easily cite some vegetable or fruit parallels that are occurring as well. So
Yeah,
it's all one hand washing the other here.
Yeah. Well, shifting gears just a little bit off of ranting and more talking about something that we're all enjoying. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into writing? And I know that the three of us have all really enjoyed your book so much, and we're really looking forward to what you have coming up next. But can you tell us and our listeners what led you to write Gaining Ground, and how hard was it to convince a publisher that people wanted to read about farming?
Oh, that's kind of a funny story, actually. I alluded to earlier, like I come from, kind of an Appalachian heritage, and that's a real oral storytelling kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, I come from a long line of joke tellers, and not just like quips, but like the full setup. A guy walks not just into a bar, and, a guy walks over a mountain and into a, whatever. These long stories, but they have like pretty satisfying, punchlines at the end. So, farming is, a lot of quiet, a lot of solitude, a lot of contemplation, easy for me to say. And so you have these real stories that are happening, near-death tractor experiences and pigs chasing up a tree and, cattle, you finding your goats 3 miles away eating in somebody's flower bed, all this stuff. And you're like, well, what do you do with this information? There's not enough beers and friends in the world to tell the stories to over and over again. So you have to share, you have to disseminate this a little bit.
Yeah.
So I was, I kind of had that collection going on in my head. And then it was 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. And I reached out to a bunch of agents, first of all, through fellow writing friends. And I was an English major in college and, served a little time in an MFA program and all that stuff. So I had some contact. And, I reached out to these agents and they all said, oh my God, you should have sent this to me in 2006 when the Omnivore Dilemma came out.
Oh, yeah.
Because organic farming is so passé now. No one wants to read about this.
Oh, no.
It's not trendy anymore. You're not a food expert because you don't work for the New York Times and you're not a celebrity chef. So why would anyone want to read about you? And I mean, that's literally, some of the responses that I got.
You're not a food expert. You're just the one growing and raising food. Right?
Yeah. I'm just some.
What do you know about farming?
Just some dude. Yeah. Evidently, I was able to punch out with my fists on the keyboard like an email. Got because I'm a troglodyte.
Farmers.
Yeah. So I went through all my contacts and all that stuff, and then I had a friend who was just look, get an agent like I did. Go get the big book in the library that's weighs 17 pounds, and just thumb through it and specifically query a bunch of agents. And within 24 hours, I got 2 responses saying yeah, absolutely. So that's how I got represented, and 6 weeks later I had a book offer. So that's how Gaining Ground came about.
Wow. Did you expect it to be a hit, with readers? What was that when you got that book published? Who was reading it, and what was that experience?
Yeah, so it was like a moonshot. It went through three printings within a month. Each printing being 10,000 copies, or maybe 10,000, 5,000, 5,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you don't know. I mean, it exceeded all odds. The odds are horrendous. It's 99% of books that get written don't get published, and the 1% of those that do sell less than 500 copies.
Wow.
And the odds are just really terrible. So
like farming.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like farming.
What percentage of those seeds grows to an actual plant, doesn't die from the weather? Yeah. So you're used to these against the odds kind of things.
Right. And just so your listeners aren't disillusioned by any of this, I make $1.85 a copy, $2.15 a copy or something like that. So even doing 20, 30, 40,000 copies hasn't changed my lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly.
Wait, are you telling me that writers make even less money than farmers?
It's somehow it's even less lucrative potentially.
Wow.
I'm not sure how that works.
Really,
we should all become contractors. I don't know.
Yeah, consultants.
Or chefs.
Exactly.
What other field could we find that makes as little money as teaching farming and writing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And schedule-wise, how are you balancing your life as a farmer and an author? I guess it's kind of if you want something done, ask a really busy person to do it, because I don't know how a farmer would even have time to write a book. But how are you kind of balancing that and finding time to do that when you're also running the farm and doing the farmers markets?
You dictate while you're on the tractor, right?
Yeah. Well, I do voice to text on on my iPhone and stuff. When I got an idea, because Walt Whitman famously said ideas are like butterflies. They just kind of they're so beautiful, and you're I'm going to remember exactly what that butterfly looked like. And maybe, later on you're it was a butterfly.
I remember it had wings.
I think it was orange.
Yeah. Exactly. So I do take notes. I tell people, how do you explain that you do what you love? If you love something, if it's knitting or, playing ultimate frisbee or doing a podcast, fill in the blank, you're going to make time for it, and you're going to spend your free time researching it and getting better at it. So, when you got something that you love, you just figure out time to do it.
Well, it looks like you keep doing it. So you've got Start Your Farm coming out, right? Is that in just a couple of months?
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that comes out in 5 weeks. Thanks for dropping that information.
Well, and I want to hear a little more about it because I love Gaining Ground. It's one of my all-time favorite food and farming books. But this Start Your Farm, it kind of sounds like a manual or like a how-to book.
Right.
Is that really what it is, or is it more story? I mean, I'm assuming that you can't possibly write without storytelling because it's in your genes and it's what you do. But so Start Your Farm, is that a nuts and bolts really aimed at people that want to give up their day job, get out of the cubicle and start a farm? Or is it something other than what the title implies?
The easy answer to that is yes. To all of that. Right. So here's the the tidy answer to that. So the first thing I did was I collaborated with Ellen Paulshuck, who's a 25-year super successful sustainable vegetable farmer who calls herself eco-organic, which might be the new word we were looking for earlier.
There it is.
Right. Awesome.
Right.
Somebody register that domain quick.
Yeah.
Copyright.
Exactly. Trademark copyright. And we got together and we said, look, there are 50 excellent books out there that explicitly state how big to make your beds and when to plant broccoli and how to construct a Joel Salatin style pastured chicken mobile and et cetera, et cetera. Exactly. All the nuts and bolts of climate and soil and pH and all this stuff. If we keeping all that in mind, Ellen and Forrest, let us two farmers sit down with 50 years at this point, cumulative experience, and say, these books exist. What other book would we need in order to really think about what it means to be a successful farmer? What does that mean? And that's going to involve some very broad economics. That's going to involve some very broad ideas of what hard work really means. It's going to involve ideas of what devotion means and why faith should be an important component of that. It's going to mean, what does it mean to work with if you're have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or you're married or have a family or have a child, what's it going to mean to market your products? What's it going to mean to find a place that values what you do? Okay. And if these things seem intentionally broad, those are the concepts. And then we become super specific about those things. Right. So we break all those down into, this is why this is super important. And here's how you go about doing it. So in a way, it is a how-to book, but not how to plant an apple tree.
Gotcha.
It's the why and the long-term vision and all the hows and all the whys, except for, this is going to turn into a red delicious apple. You know what I mean? It's like everything but that.
Yeah.
That's so cool, because I think that's something that business owners really need, is like, how is this going to affect your relationships? How is this going to affect your, I don't know, just your interactions with people, your 10 years down the road, not necessarily economically, but in all other aspects of life.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any business, yeah.
And it answers some of the big questions. Should you buy land? Is a land ownership a 20th century concept, and we need to be moving on to a 21st century? Or should there be a hybrid? Big concepts of like, what does self-care look like as a farmer? Like, how do you not work 7 days a week, 365 days a year? How do you pay yourself? How do you legitimately write yourself a paycheck? And
how do you afford to pay other people with what the labor situation is and what have you? Yeah, we know a lot of our newer farmers are leasing because, well,
of course,
we work in California, and who can afford to buy land here? Certainly not somebody who's farming. So that's a big challenge, is they've got to figure out this new model, and we need a word without all the negative connotations that are related to the word sharecropper, but that's essentially what a lot of them are doing.
Sharecropping isn't what we're talking about. I mean, that's easy. We live in such a binary world, where everyone wants to go hardcore, hard left or hard right? But there is an incredible sweet spot in the middle where there are experienced, aging out farmers who don't have children or even grandchildren that are interested in farming. So many. And here we have, there's like literally hundreds of thousands of these people. Okay, and not all of them are going to mentor, but many of them would willingly take on a young, 22-year-old woman out of college who wouldn't have access to the capital of $500,000 to buy 10 acres or less outside of Los Angeles or whatever.
Right.
What am I talking about? I'm talking like $2 million or whatever it would be.
Yeah.
Millions. And then how do you recapitalize those land costs?
Exactly.
We're not just talking about the operating costs of buying some shovels and some turnip seeds. We're talking about making an honest return, getting 5% return back on your investment cost. Because who goes around dropping $2 million into anything without getting some sort of, dividend or rent on it? But that's what farmers have done.
And I don't know if you see it, I'm guessing that you do if you're only an hour out of DC, but I mean, the other thing that happens here is those retiring farmers have to sort of have a moral impetus to mentor a new farmer, because the other option for them is selling to a developer who can immediately make money back on that land at a much higher ratio than you can farming.
Yeah, and that's the heartbreaking thing, Kat, is because so many of these farmers have not passed along their investment costs. Yes, they've maybe passed along their operating costs, but they never pass along the investment cost of the land. And the only way to unlock that value is to sell the land, and that becomes those farmers' retirements because they've never been able to save for retirement. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that around here at $10,000 an acre, and I'm an hour outside of DC, to get even a small scale farm, you're looking at $100,000 before you get out of the gate. And what bank is going to lend that to you?
Right.
Because nobody's going to lend to an inexperienced farmer $100,000.
Right.
So yeah.
It's
incredible.
No easy answers. Are the answers in your next book?
Solutions. There's a lot of on and off ramps, as we say. It's not this this monolithic conversation anymore. Dozens of options and possibilities.
That's great. No, I'm glad to hear that, because it's the problems seem insurmountable in terms of keeping farming going as so many of these guys age out. Thinking about solutions is incredibly valuable. Thank you very much, you and your co-author.
Yeah, and I think just one really amazing takeaway, and maybe we could segue this into our question for the week, but I think what gaining ground and just kind of your philosophy just brings this, this nobility to farming. And you talk about how there is this social marginalization of farmers and how the way that people view farmers. And I think that there are a lot of young people that do want to get into farming, and there is this generational divide of how are you going to make money in farming? Why would you want to go into that? But there's this new generation of young people that do see how amazing it is. So I think that people like you doing what you're doing and writing books is a really cool way to kind of refocus the important role that farmers play in everyone's lives.
Yeah, such a big value.
I appreciate that. And, it's really easy to be inherently cynical about all this because, in a way, we're all food experts. I know that I'm not going to go to Chick-fil-A and pay $38 for a chicken sandwich, right? Everyone would lose their mind. Yeah. There'd be pitchforks and torches in the street, But what are the genuine economic costs of creating that chicken sandwich versus an authentically free range chicken that was raised by the farmer that everyone most people probably imagine are being raised and sold at fast food restaurants. This cognitive dissonance. So how do you live in a world where everyone's quote unquote a food expert, but everyone also, quote unquote, knows that you can't make a living at farming? How do you bridge that divide?
Right.
So we, it's 2018 and we've got to come up with some solutions and some answers that haven't previously existed. That's all there's to it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for helping that. Thank you for helping build those bridges.
Thank you.
Okay, well, so like I mentioned earlier, Forrest, every week we go around and we have a question of the week for our guests. And since you are so literary, this week our question is, what is your favorite book about food?
Well, that's kind of a trick question for me.
You can plug your own book if you want to.
Yeah. Oh, no, I would not do that. I wouldn't encourage him. Yeah, I famously heard once that Prince only listened to his own music.
I've heard that
which
too.
seems unlikely because I know he was ripping off Earth, Wind, and Fire and stuff like that. So
Had to have heard some of it.
Right. So I would never go down that path. I mean, no disrespect to Prince. I mean, I love his work. That wasn't a jab at Prince. But one thing I'm very cautious.
Pitchforks.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't want people boycotting our podcast. We love Prince.
Our outro music is now Prince.
Yeah, exactly. That's funny. Yeah, I mean, one thing I've kind of conscientiously tried not to do is read other food or farming authors, so I wouldn't be, you read somebody that you admire and you can't help but imitate them,
Yeah,
or like take their ideas. So I've always tried to read outside my purview, as one might say, and I kind of, to sidestep the question a little bit, like Walt Whitman, I think I maybe alluded to him earlier, is like our original grass-based poet, because he wrote Leaves of Grass, for crying out loud. It's like right there in the title. And he, Walt Whitman says, if don't mourn for me when I die, just look for me underneath your boot soles, right? And I think it gives me goosebumps, like sitting here in Virginia. To think about how deeply connected this guy, who was, not only a poet, but a surgeon, a nurse during the Civil War and worked in the post office. I mean, this guy wasn't a farmer, but he had stuff really figured out, how deeply all connected everything is. It is a circle. It's a sacred circle of nutrients and photosynthesis and sunlight and space dust,
Yeah, amazing.
And it doesn't get much more real than that. So in a roundabout way, and just, if your listeners haven't ever read Walt Whitman, here's my challenge to them. Just go to your library and open up Leaves of Grass anywhere to any page and start reading, and tell me if within 10 lines of wherever you start, if he doesn't allude to sustainable agriculture or sustainable living or sustainable communities, some form of theme of sustainability, because this guy had it going on in the 1860s.
So stuck with
Justine?
Well, right now I'm reading Animal Vegetable Miracle, and I'm
Barbara
loving it so far.
Kingsolver.
Yeah, really fantastic. So.
Yeah, one of my all-time favorites. That's a good
she's
one.
amazing. Kat, what do you?
Well,
you have
I
a
could
long
throw in
list of
Gaining
books.
Ground. I know I have a long
I've
list.
seen
We're
your
sitting
bookshelf.
here in our little studio-ish office, and we are surrounded by books, many of which are food books that are mine, and I should be passing those along to somebody, but then I go back and read the same ones. Gaining Ground is one of my all-time favorites. It really is. Also, Eating for Beginners. That was an excellent book that talked about dealing with young children and eating habits, and at the same time, she worked as a chef, and then she went and worked on some farms to really walk it back to what it takes to produce the food that they're bringing in. Tomato Land by Barry Estabrook. I mean,
Sure.
so many. I don't know where to stop, so I'll stop.
Okay, Bridget, what about you?
Well, I really like the storytelling. Like, I like to read the kind of more factual books and stuff like that, but I like the storytelling stuff. And one of my all-time favorite books that just is really rooted in like food meaning is The Gastronomy of Marriage. And it's just
That's a good one.
She's Chinese American, her husband's Italian, and they have to, and she's a vegetarian and he's not, and so it really dives into like the root of food and like culture in your eating habits and preferences and diet, and she shops
Compromise
and cooking. And my mom gave me this book when I was dating my boyfriend, who's now my husband, and he was a vegetarian and I was not, and I was having some conflict, and it's just a really good book about like where your food comes from. And she tries to eat healthy, and so she's going to the little shops and the farmers market. They're in New York, and it just really opened my eyes to like different facets of like where food is coming from and what it means when you actually bring it to your table in your home with your family, and how you can relate to food with that. So that's one of my favorites. Yeah.
Cool. Well, now we all have our summertime reading list.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, Forrest, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and good luck promoting your new book. We're excited for it to hit the shelves.
That's also on our reading list too.
Yeah, that is on our reading list. Coming up, Start Your Farm, and I was mentioning to Forrest in one of our little Facebook exchanges that we need to get that into our order for our bookstore at Intense next February.
Yes.
Yeah, good
Very, very kind. Thank you, guys.
We're excited. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening along. Please leave us a review on iTunes and tell us how you liked today's episode. Be sure you subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss the next one. And if you want more farmers market tips, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter at intensebusiness.com and follow us on Instagram at intensebusiness. The 2019 Intense Conference will be held in San Diego February 24th through 26th, and we hope that you'll join us. If you want to hear more from Forrest, pick up his new book, Start Your Farm, in September.
This podcast is produced by Intense Business, where passion meets profit. Today's episode was recorded and edited by Justine Marzoni-Mead. Original music by David Mead. Special thanks to our guest, Forrest Pritchard, and San Diego Markets.